Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my talk this afternoon. It's getting on in the day, but really happy to be speaking today, giving you a bit of a run through on how to go about recording your GDG meetups. And in some ways, this is actually a bit of a follow-up to the wonderful talk that Joel did earlier today. It's covering more like the why you'd want to or not want to do recording. So I'll be sort of elaborating a bit more about the more nitty-gritty details of how you go about doing recording your meetups, if that's what you choose to do. So to start with, I guess just a little bit about myself. I'm an Android engineer. I've been doing it for about 8 years now, so I guess I get to call myself a senior engineer. And I'm also like a reasonably recent co-organizer of the GDG in Melbourne, Australia. What I am not is a videographer or a video editor. So this is really just something I do as a side gig, as it were. And basically, I'm just here to pass on most of the lessons and mistakes that I've made during my time doing this to hopefully save you the trouble of doing that yourselves and going through all that learning process. For those of you who don't know where Melbourne is, we're sort of like down there at the bottom, southeast corner of Australia. So we did have a bit of a flight getting here. Now, what I'd like to cover today is some of the different approaches that you can take to recording your meetups and DevFests, the equipment involved, some tips that have sort of been hard-won along the way, some lessons that I've learned while doing this, and the kind of the future for what we're doing in our meetups. So to start with, the bare basics. If you're going to record your meetups, this is about as simple as it gets. You've got the presenter with their laptop hooked up to a big screen or a projector like here, and you just basically stick your camera in front of them and start recording. So that's essentially what I did to begin with. And as you can see, here are some of our lovely GDG organizers and a local GDE, Andy, presenting. And this is what the output looks like when you do that. Now, with this basic approach, you've got some pros and cons. Now, the pros are it's super easy to get started. Essentially, you just need something that will record video. And it's very, very easy to train anyone else to do this. You just basically ask them to position themselves somewhere in the room, preferably use a tripod of some sort, but that's about it, and you record the talk. Minimal equipment is required. Essentially, everyone at the very least has got a mobile phone, or you might have some other kind of camera that you can use. It's pretty straightforward. And it's easy to publish. You've got a video at the end of it. Just pull it off your camera, or if you're on your phone, you can just directly upload it to YouTube. You're done. So really simple, but there are trade-offs. The first is it's very difficult to capture the slides in any reasonable way, especially if you're trying to get the slides and the presenter at the same time. Like you may have seen in those stills that I showed a second ago, like you can see the presenter really well, or you can see the slides really well. It's really hard to do both. The sound quality is another con. Like, it's not going to be great. Like, you might be lucky and get something halfway decent, especially if there's not too much echo in the room and there's decent like sound system like there is here, but often it's going to be pretty poor quality. And there's no redundancy. Something goes wrong, your phone crashes, you fill up a memory card, you lose out. There's no backups. There's no redundancy involved in this system. So having done that, I thought, well, I wanted to do something a bit better. That was an okay start, but really it wasn't great results, and I wasn't that happy with what was being produced. So this was a chance to move up and improve the setup. So the main things I wanted to focus on were the deficiencies of that first setup, mainly the slides and the audio. So what was involved was first getting gear. I'm a bit of a tech head. Like, this was my first port of call. I wanted to get better stuff. So basically what I got was a couple of mics. Interestingly, first tip is you probably don't need to worry about wireless. Like, I bought that wireless mic. I don't even know if it works because I have never actually used it to record a single GDG meetup. But that just normal wired mic. Don't worry, I'll have references to all the equipment at the end. It's basically been used for the better part of a year. Works great. It's just really simple, cheap, off Amazon, has a 3.5mm plug, works great, just plugs in, no problems. The other device in the picture here is this box. So you can see, like, just for scale, that's what the size of it is. This is a nice little thing, probably built mainly for gamers. What it lets you do is put an HDMI input in, pass through that HDMI out, and also plug in audio input, like 3.5mm socket. You might be able to see just that tiny little hole there for the microphone. And what it'll do is if you plug in a USB stick or a drive, it will record both that audio and video stream just as a MP4 file onto your USB stick. However, when you come to set that up, this is basically now what the setup looks like. So instead of that simple camera only, now what you have is your recording device. So you've still got the camera, but now the microphone is there, like somewhere hopefully near the speaker, wired into that HDMI box. You've also got the HDMI coming out of the laptop into that box, and going out of that box into wherever the projector's hooked up, and that box is recording both the audio and the slides. The camera's still standalone, it's just doing its own thing. Now, the trade-off with this is complexity. As you just heard me say, we've got multiple connections. In fact, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 connections just to that little box that you have to manage. The first thing that happens, and here's one of my tips, is you want to have some tape or blue tack, because this weighs like about 40 grams. Once you plug all those things in, what it wants to do is just fall off whatever surface you put it on, because the cables are much heavier than the actual box. And it gets really hot. So it's a good idea to have a piece of metal to put underneath it to distribute that heat, or on top of it, because whatever they did to make this box, it wasn't spend money on making it able to dissipate heat effectively. Now, just a small diversion in terms of the cameras. I've actually used a couple of different ones. I had this really old Kodak one that I used to start with. Then more recently, I've moved on to using just the standard old Sony camcorder. But it really does not matter. Like, this is one of the things I've learned along the way, is people don't really focus too much on the video of the speaker. What they're more interested in is the slides and the audio. Those are the key things. The visuals from the speaker, as long as there's some vague human kind of blob there, that seems to be enough for people. I've not really had any complaints saying, oh, I can't really make out the face of the speaker properly. But oh boy, do people complain when the audio is not up to par. So really, like, I'm even, like, this month, one of my nice co-organizers, Karen, is going to be volunteering to do the recordings while I'm away, and we're going to just even try using a standard Logitech webcam to make things even simpler, because really that's all you need. And I think Joel mentioned that that's what they use, is just the standard old webcams, plenty for recording the video of the speaker. Now, if you want to know what it looks like in terms of the setup, it's reasonably discreet. Like, you can see I had to put in nice big arrows there to show you where the camera is. It's a bit more visible with the nice red microphone that's in a couple of those shots. And you can see me in one of those shots, or in a couple of those shots, nursing the camera. But really, it looks after itself. In terms of the outputs, now that you've got a separate feed for your slides and your video, they're two separate video streams, and the separate audio stream, or sometimes you can be separate audio stream, you can go crazy with how your video looks like. So instead of it just being that kind of like wide shot of the slides on the wall and the presenter, now you can do whatever you like. So these are just a sample of the ones that we've tried both for the meetups and, as you can see, last year's DevFest. I think I've actually done, if you go through our YouTube channel, you'll probably find 1 or 2 more layouts that I've tried along the way. But basically, it's whatever you like to come up with, because you're actually editing this now in post-production. You're taking the video streams and putting them together after the fact. So the pros and cons of this approach: very good quality for your slide capture. You can just, as you saw in the previous slide, you can see them quite nicely when you're watching full screen. Good quality audio. It's not awesome quality audio, but it's much, much better than just with camera. That mic does a pretty good job, and it's only, I think, $15 or something, and that's Australian money. Medium level of complexity, so it's not too hard to set up, and you can have whatever nice video layout you like. Nothing's for free, so there are downsides. You need more equipment, so there's more cost involved. You're buying now a few more things. It's more complex. It's not super complex, but now you've got much more that you need to get someone briefed on and explain to them how it all works, how all the connections go. The biggest thing is it's way more time consuming. Post-production of video, like, I'm not an expert, but even like I used to work with people who were video editors, and boy, it takes a lot of time. Whether you're an expert or an amateur, this is not something that you can do very quickly. And the more talks you're recording, the longer it takes. When you get to something like DevFest, where you've got dozens of talks done in one day, this is going to be a very time-consuming process. And unfortunately, there's no good feedback if something goes wrong with the slide or sound capture, this little box. It has a little blinking LED that should show you things are all being recorded well. I have had at least one time where it kept on blinking perfectly, and then at the end of the day, when I actually plugged that USB stick into my computer, there was a nice 0-byte file there. So, nada. Luckily, this is where redundancy comes in. I at least had the video of the person talking. I could nicely ask them to take the slides, and then it was on me to basically recreate the whole talk experience, basically advancing slides in post-production along with the recorded video and the not-so-great sound from the video. So, setup number 3. We evolved a bit more, and this is I called mix and match because I couldn't really think of a better name for it. But really what was involved was more gear, or I should say better gear. So, like again, similar to what if you attended Joel's talk, if you didn't catch up on it when the recordings come out, I got a new HDMI device here, which, like this one, does HDMI in, HDMI out, but the USB output is not to a storage device, it's a video output to a laptop. Basically, it just pretends to be a webcam. And so what you can do is then record that video using a laptop or a desktop. This I got just because my camera didn't have a USB output, but for instance, if you're using a simple webcam, you wouldn't need an extra HDMI to USB dongle like I needed for that Sony camcorder. The setup now changes a little bit. So as you can see, we've still got the same recording equipment, but now everything is going into a laptop or a desktop computer. The video goes in via this HDMI capture device. The microphone goes in directly, or if it's a USB microphone, it would go in via USB as well. And then the camera is now using an HDMI to USB converter to feed into the laptop. Now, it's not magic. On the laptop, you need something to handle all of that. And again, I've used Open Broadcaster, OBS, and have found it a fantastic package. It's open source, works well, works on all 3 major operating systems. It's fantastic. What it looks like is essentially this. It's a bit meta, isn't it? Because I'm using this presentation that I was doing as a run-through using it. So what you do is you create your layout in the software now. This is not post-production. You're actually creating a layout that it's going to use while real-time, while the recording's happening. And you just get to put all your video inputs where you want them. You can have static inputs, so you've got our logo, like a nice background, and you also nicely have audio monitoring, so you can see what the audio levels are, as well as, or even if you don't want to plug in headphones, but it's nice to have both, you can see the audio levels visually and make sure you're not, you don't have it set too low, for instance, or too high. And it's really quite straightforward to use. You just like literally start recording, stop record, same button, and that's about it. In terms of using it, I thought I'd talk about DevFest. So last year's DevFest, we had three parallel tracks. Luckily, I had a great volunteer from Sydney come down and help me, Mitchell. He brought down his equipment that he uses up there to do recording, so we were able to cover all three tracks because I didn't have enough equipment to cover all three, and we were on two different levels like we are here, so it would have been really hard to run around, and there were multiple flights of steps which were actually locked, so the stairwell was hard to get through, so it would have been really hard for one person to cover all three rooms at the same time. But the interesting thing is that for this, we use both approaches. We use both that offline recording approach with post-processing afterwards, as well as the basically mixing using OBS. And you can see the room layouts were really different. Like we had two really big rooms. The two big rooms were set up quite differently, and then there was the smaller room, which was similar to here, which had a much easier setup. So you can see I had recording equipment sort of sticking out here in one of the rooms. In another room, we could have the recording gear out the way to the side behind a pillar. So that was quite interesting to contrast the use of those two techniques. Now, the pros and cons of this third technique are similar to the second one. We've got really great slide capture, got great audio quality. Now we've got nice real-time monitoring of the recording. So you know if your camera suddenly cuts out, you'll know about it. If the box goes on the fritz, you'll know that you've lost the video from the slides. And it's easy to publish. All the setup's done beforehand. So when you come to publish your video on YouTube, you just basically got to trim the start and end bits off when people are sort of rabbiting on or switching laptops around, and you're good to go. There's none of this heavy post-production work. Still, there are no silver bullets. So you need even more equipment. If you do what I did and basically do the second approach first, now you're replacing some of your previous equipment because you made you've outgrown the previous technique, so you need to buy more equipment, and this equipment costs a bit more than the previous one. It's much longer now to set up because you've got way more cables. Now you've got all these HDMI to USB converters. You've got to cable them. You've got to usually tape them down so people don't trip over it or ask them to sort of walk around. It takes longer to pack everything up. I'm usually the last one out of the place to leave because I'm still packing up when everyone's already off at the pub having a drink. And it's much more complex to train people. It's a much more complex setup. You have to explain now the software as well as the hardware setup. The other thing that probably falls under equipment as much as anything else is you need a fairly powerful laptop. We discovered at one meetup that you can't really use an old underpowered laptop. It just doesn't cut it. Basically, I've looked at using much lower powered equipment. I've even thought about a Raspberry Pi, but what we're talking about here is two parallel HDMI 1080p streams that are being mixed in real time and an audio input, and then everything's then written to disk. So I've got a fairly grunty laptop that is at about 50% CPU the entire time I'm recording, and that's it's a couple of years, maybe 3-year-old laptop that was top spec back then. So you need reasonably expensive hardware in terms of your laptop or desktop to record this way and use OBS. So you can't really use a 10-year-old Celeron to do this. Now, moving on to the future, the future's live. Basically, OBS is actually really well set up to do live streaming. We haven't done this yet. I want to experiment a bit before I go for it. But basically, the only thing you do is click a different button that says streaming. You enter a couple of config things for YouTube, and you're done. And voila, you've got your live stream. And that is it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And here's your resources. Thank you.